It is my tremendous pleasure to introduce this afternoon's second speaker, an amazing, brilliant scholar and also a dear friend, Dr. Durba Mitra. Dr. Durba Mitra is Assistant Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Harvard University. She is a leading scholar in the history of sexuality, transnational feminisms, and global feminist thought. Her first book, Indian Sex Life, Sexuality, and the Colonial Origins of Modern Social Thought, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2020, is a path-breaking history of the sexual sciences in India. It was, I think, a few weeks ago, right? Awarded, I look to you, you're like, no. Awarded the Bernard S. Cohen Book Prize by the Association for Asian Studies. And also received an honorable mention for the J. Willard Hurst Book Prize from the Law and Society Association. She's published articles in leading journals, including Signs, the Journal of Asian Studies, and Gender and History. And she has also maintained a strong commitment to public-facing feminist writing, evidenced in her truly stunning celebration of the 30th anniversary of the film Mississippi Masala, published in Public Books a few weeks ago, and her co-authored It's Time to Reckon with the History of Asian Women in America, published in Harper's Bazaar last year. In a moment when Black feminist and women of color feminist historiography often centers on archival absence, Dr. Mitra's Indian sex life begins with an archival excess, the abundant presence of the figure of the prostitute across a wide range of archives from colonial India. As she notes in the opening pages of her book, quote, "I found the prostitute everywhere, across different archives from colonial India, appearing, disappearing, and then reappearing in files that seemingly had little to do with the regulation of sexual commerce." How, she asks, can we make sense of the hyper appearance of this concept? And how do we understand its capacity to describe, regulate, organize, police, and categorize so many different kinds of women, always with the impulse to mark deviant female sexuality? And how, Dr. Mitra asks, did deviant female sexuality, often conglomerated in the archives as prostitution, become the defining method of describing Indian society from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries? And most importantly, she asks, what happens if we begin with a premise that at the heart of the study of Indian society is the control of female sexuality? Tracing archival saturation rather than absence requires a method that in one interview, Durba Mitra has described as idling, sitting in close proximity to archives, thinking with and describing their redundancies, circularities, and relentless obsessions. As she writes in a reflection on the book, quote, "I wanted to document the revelation and exhaustion one feels when confronting an archive that claims to exhaustively enumerate the intimate lives of women, and to make that exhaustion part of the argument of the book itself." Indeed, Indian sex life shows Mitra getting close to legal, sociological, and forensic archives that use the project of identifying the figure of the prostitute as proof of the fundamental importance of the social sciences. Indian sex life is also distinct in that it offers what Mitra terms a concept history. Rather than treat the prostitute as a figure in need of rescue, Mitra studies the prostitute as a form of social knowledge. The work of recuperation has been valuable and even central to feminist and sexuality studies focused on sex work. Yet Mitra offers us a crucial methodological intervention, moving from the prostitute as object to the prostitute as concept. This shift allows us to newly engage how the idea of the prostitute shapes the study of the world, or as Samantha Pinto notes in her review of Indian sex life, quote, "how patriarchy, the colony, the university, and the state do their work and imagine their work." Dr. Mitra is currently working on her second book, The Future That Was, Feminist Thought in the Decolonizing World, which is under contract with Princeton University Press. The Future That Was is the first intellectual history of third world feminisms in the decolonizing world, or a history, as Mitra describes, of feminist ideas in motion. In The Future That Was, she offers an intellectual history of third world feminisms in the decolonizing world, with a particular focus on the research methods and theories that feminists in South Asia and Africa developed. As with Indian sex life, she continues her commitment to studying the development of the social scientific study of women and gender, tracking how the interventions, ideas, and concepts developed by third world feminists birthed forms of social science that continue to undergird human rights discourse and international development. Over the course of the book, Mitra focuses on 5 genres of feminist knowledge production: the organization, the conference, the report, the protest, and the book. This new project, like Indian Sex Life, ultimately attends to the politics of knowledge, here with an interest in the promises and paradoxes of feminist social research, as the women she studies engage the history, forms, and methods of social science, attempting to create what Mitra calls new visions of research on women. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Durba Mitra to the stage.
Can everybody hear me? Good afternoon. The report, or whatever happened to third world feminist theory. First, I want to thank what I have down as the bestest, Professor Jennifer Nash, Professor Jocelyn Alcott, and Duke GSF for this extremely generous invitation. I am so humbled and excited to be here and in conversation with all of you. And to Julie Winmore and everybody here for all of the work that you have done to support this event. Duke University occupies the ancestral lands of the Shakori, Innu, Tuscarora people, and exists in spaces and is enriched by plantation slavery. Today, it exists alongside diverse communities, including one of the largest Native American communities east of the Mississippi here in North Carolina. I have learned from the work of the Native American Student Alliance here at Duke University, which supports students and supports the advocacy for students, as well as for research on the history of dispossession here at Duke. We have convened together exactly 2 years into a never-ending pandemic that has wreaked havoc on already tenuous systems of labor and care here in the US and around the world, that exploits and subordinates women, queer, and trans peoples. We sit now in this room with the thread of what it means to be together, breathing. These 2 years have laid bare the clear anti-democratic present, where the state-driven biopolitics of life and death has produced measures where economic profit determines all public policy above the actual lives of people. The economization of life, to use Michelle Murphy's phrase, building on Michel Foucault's indispensable insights on biopolitics, has taken new shape in the form of endless graphs and charts on death rates solely in relation to economic profit. The imperative to quantify the value of life stands in stark contrast to the wide-ranging, extraordinary political movements of minoritized people in protests that demand a space for living, in the language of citizenship, that lives matter, not one more life can or should be lost. People in mass mobilizations have demanded the ability to continue living in a world intent on disappearing them. So we dwell here between the cruel biopolitics of life and a new mass politics for the living. This is the moment we inhabit now, 50 years after the rapid expansion of aspirational international feminist movements that reached across geographies, policymaking, and global funding networks. What have ideas of international feminisms created over half a century? And how are we to understand this half century of feminist writing and thinking? To assess where international feminisms are now is a monumental project, one that requires thinking collectively on what has been monumentalized and what must fall. Today, I want to offer some reflections on one dimension of these large monumental histories, to think of the vast archives of policy reports created in the making of international, global, and third world feminisms. So let me turn to the topic of my talk, a seemingly mundane, dry object of study, the social science report on the status of women reports that proliferated from the 1960s all over the world, and particularly then across the actively decolonizing spaces of Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, as well as Latin America, who sought approval in the new rubric of United Nations internationalism. The Status of Women report thrives today as a key measure of national indices in a rubric of gender and development that has reigned supreme for decades. So how are we to reckon with the rise of the report as the preeminent genre for writing women and then sexual minorities for most of the people of the world, to use Partha Chatterjee's phrase, for almost half a century? How do we understand the many third world women who became essential to the enterprise of the report? I suggest we need to ask why women have been largely rendered researchable in the modern policy-oriented social scientific report, a self-perpetuating structure of knowledge that has come to overflow archives and has overdetermined how we read and write women in much of the world. A profoundly unequal political economy of knowledge has sustained the dominance of social science in the making of knowledge about women and sexual minorities for decades. This is, of course, a fitting setting to make such an inquiry. Feminists have long debated who produces what constitutes feminist theory and what abstract concepts, what genealogies of philosophy, what forms of critical theory get to claim the sign of theory, and who and what does not. My query today, however, is not about expanding what counts as theory. Rather, I ask, what are the epistemic effects of the self-reproducing economy of knowledge on gender and women in empirical, actionable, policy-oriented research that has thrived in geographies of the third world? From this genealogy, we may begin to ask, whatever happened to third world feminist theory from the third world? My work here, to think with Kaji Amin, is to de-idealize third world women and third world feminisms, to return to vexed genealogies of thought that we inherit and cite in the present. Those complicated, often paradoxical ideas that come under the umbrella term third world that have come to have enigmatic, often romanticized status in contemporary feminist theory and critique. I'm interested in these complicated imaginaries of feminism, those imaginaries that were not purely anti-state, anti-governance, revolutionary, or utopian, in women and ideas that invested in and critiqued the post-colonial nation as a site of feminist liberation. Three key issues emerge from my preliminary reflections on the Status of Women report. First, the rise of an unequal, self-perpetuating international political economy of the report. Second, the increasing dominance of gender essentialist disciplines like demography and population that have shaped enduring feminist attachments to biologically essentialist understandings of the category of woman. And third, the marginalization of other ways of knowing and the self-perpetuating life of the policy-oriented report on women. The Status report became essential to new normative visions of the political, relegating vast terrains of struggle, of activist actions and behaviors as non or extra political and beyond the purview of formal politics. How might we reckon with the paradoxes of this legacy? The radical world-making desires of third world feminisms among minoritized and formerly colonized women, and the material constraints that have shaped the actualities of intellectual work for most researchers for decades. At the heart of my inquiry is a call to develop a critical hermeneutic for the social scientific report on women and sexual minorities. So let me turn and illustrate this history by turning to an example of a report. A collective of women bear witness to the empirical quantification of their lives in the form of a data visualization on the declining status of women. This striking image frames the cover of the 1977 study, Critical Issues on the Status of Women, a summary of the paradigm-shifting Indian report towards equality published in December of 1974. The cover features a graph with lines visualizing the declining place of women in India. A white line stands in stark contrast with an intricate black grid, charting decline from 1901 to 1971 and beyond. Superimposed on the empty space below the graph is a sea of white outlines of what seems like the back of heads, no faces in view. One can infer that these outlines are Indian women, the subject of the study that follows, with hair buns populating the crowd. In the bottom right corner, in bold black letters, stands the acronym ICSSR, the Indian Council of Social Science Research, the young government agency in India that funded many of the earliest studies
But
on
we have
women
to still
in
listen to a little bit
post-colonial
more.
India.
I mean, you should turn it on for sure.
The vertical and horizontal axes of the graph are unnamed. The reader knows only that there is urgency in the data visualization. It is as if this collective of women were watching in anticipation of a future that was to come, a future of women's quantification through the expanding domain of social science and social scientific reports that have dominated the study of women since the 1970s. So today, rather than attempting a comprehensive analysis of thousands and thousands of reports with their millions of pages of data, aggregate data, charts, and descriptions, I want to think with you about the rise of the idea of that report. The archives of the status of women reveal a paradoxical history of the promises of women's rights in a time of decolonization and the limits of state-sponsored social science to fulfill the dreams of women's liberation. In assembling these archives, I meditate on the emancipatory promise and failures of the social sciences. If, as Black feminist geographer Catherine McKittrick argues with repetition, quote, description is not liberation, description is not liberation, then how are we to understand women researchers, mainly in the decolonizing world, but across the world, who saw in the description of women's status the possibility of freedom? Black and brown third world feminist thinkers from the 1970s and 1980s, from Angela Davis to Hortense Spillers to Chandra Mohanty, cautioned against dominant first world policy research that perpetuated rhetorical fictions of the pathological deficiencies of Black, Indigenous, and third world women. Yet despite these early critiques of the essentializing tendencies of the report, the policy report on women became ubiquitous in the years that followed, often authored by key feminist researchers and activists located in decolonizing spaces. So would disciplinary knowledge offer emancipatory politics? Transnational research on the status of women emerged with fervor among Cold War era state-sponsored social science in spaces of Asia, Africa, and Caribbean in particular. In this period, international discourses moved from the woman's question of the 19th century to the status of women. With the UN development decade in the 1960s, the rise of women's movements in the 1970s, and the declaration of the UN International Women's Year in 1975 came the first wide-scale comprehensive social science research on women. The buildup to the UN conference in Mexico City in 1975 was key for this new genre of the status of women, the event that historian Jocelyn Alcott, in her extraordinary history, argues was, quote, the launchpad for an array of global feminisms, end quote. This conference, followed by the UN Decade on Women and then Beijing 10 years later in 1995, spurred a veritable revolution of social scientific knowledge by and about women. The Status of Women report offers insights into feminist engagements with the state prior to and in the making of what Janet Halley, Prabhakota Rachel Rinpoche, and Hila Shamir have called governance feminisms. While early reports in the 1960s and 70s were not uniform, by the late 1980s, the Status of Women report was standardized with genre conventions that prioritized quantitative surveys, methods of demography, and comparative aggregate categories, norms that soon came to dominate the vast knowledge industry on women in development and then gender in development. The Status of Women report had multiple functions. It served as the assessment of the place of women in a society in terms of their legal roles and their access to suffrage. It was a reporting structure for donors, an argument for continued funding, and an essential comparative metric in new structures of international governance. The genre conventions introduced by the report on the status of women produced long-lasting legacies in a broader domain of sexual rights, in the HIV/AIDS epidemic that followed, and in the reports that dominated LGBTQ and now trans activism around the world on sexual rights, what Kaguro Macharia has described as, quote, report realism in the NGO reports. Researchers recruited to write these texts were often highly educated women from dominant classes, ethnicities, race, and castes in the third world. They were upwardly mobile elite women who would have complicated trajectories in the feminist mobilizations that followed. These researchers self-identified as third world women and third world feminists and invested in third world internationalism as a feminist project of self-determination. Their novel projects of knowledge about women's status were framed as, quote, action research by leading Indian feminist Veena Majumdar, a primary architect of the Indian report, founding figure in the field of women's studies in India, and the first head of the ICSSR's program on women's studies. This utilitarian view of knowledge framed any and all research on women as research with a purpose. Social scientific methods of comparative classification and demographic quantification were linked to what Caribbean feminist economist Peggy Antrobus described as the commitment of a generation of women fighting for feminist futures through development in a time of decolonization. Indeed, in this moment, the quantification of women through empirical research on their status was deemed a necessary new measure, not only of women, but of the domain of life itself. Women's status was the gold standard in a new universalist calculus of economic development. By the late 1980s, scholars and policymakers had declared the status of a nation's women to be the primary index of capability in a new lexicon of development economics. For economists, perhaps most notably Amartya Sen, the indices of capability could be used to measure what he termed, quote, substantive freedom. This insidious use of the term freedom linked to its substance in free market development economics centered on a comparable index of women's demographics. It's striking, as is Sen's suggestion, that an economic calculus of individual productivity was the sole avenue to freedom for third world women. It is remarkable how this line of thinking in economics and policy framed the language of freedom in the late 20th century as a social good through the promotion of women's debt, which was named microcredit, and endless labor, in stark contrast with Black, women of color, and decolonial feminists who insisted that women's quantified productive and reproductive labor was unfreedom, perpetuated in systems of slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism. Economists placed women at the center of this new economic calculus of liberation. And who needed freedom more than the third world woman? The expansive genre of the Status of Women report became a primary form of knowledge generated at a time of post-colonial internationalism, what Peggy Antrobus described as a new information order. Antrobus, the first head of the Women's Bureau in Jamaica, founding member of the Third World Women's Research Collective, Dawn, and a leading Caribbean feminist, invested and imagined a promising future for this information order. This knowledge economy of international reports has created enduring entanglements between national governments, NGOs, international institutions of the United Nations, and its social scientific apparatus, what I describe as the proliferation of anachronymization. That is to say, UNESCO, the ILO, the UNFPA, and then foundations such as Ford. And really, I keep trying to figure out a way to write this book without using acronyms, and I haven't yet figured that out. Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for that good luck. The framework of the status of women in reports reflect an early internationalist imaginary, with the language of the status of women emerging as early as the 1930s in the League of Nations as a legal assessment. By the 1960s, national status of women commissions began to proliferate around the world, with reports written in the United States, the UK, Poland, Denmark, Taiwan, and then initiated in Afghanistan. Commissions then started in Argentina, Australia, Austria, Canada, Japan, Libya, and Norway, then India, Pakistan, Trinidad and Tobago, Tanzania, and then Kenya. The Ford Foundation, in particular, would play a vital role in the creation of the status of women as an object of study, and quickly became a key patron for third world women and women of color feminist researchers. Ford funded the participation of third world women and Black feminists from the United States to attend the UN international conferences. Ford was the seed funding for women's studies programs around the world, from historically Black colleges like Spelman to wide-ranging gender and development programs across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. And you can see there's an ongoing assessments, international programs related to the status, roles, and opportunities for women. This is just a small, tiny small sample of what exists in the Ford archives. It also underwrote the publication of anthologies and was a key funder of publishers like the Feminist Press, which published essential collections of third world women's writings, like from South Asia and across North, East, South, and West Africa, some of the only collections of women's writings that still exist today. The status of equality, then, what could it be? What kind of information can be found in early status of women reports? The genre may be familiar to many of us who have conducted research on many parts of the world. The reports often list an agency or commission. Often they name no author at all. They offer a uniform table of contents and introduction that give a broad overview of the study. They feature chapters that succinctly summarize key findings of research on law, economic roles, and end with policy recommendations. Yet, as I explore next, there was little standardization in some of the early status of women reports in a range of areas researched. What was standard was the premise of the study, a universal idea of integration-based equality in women's status in relation to an unspoken standard of men. Women were to be equated, made commensurate, and analogized across time and geography by nation state. A project of universal and universalist comparison that traveled from the narrow legal domain to encompass all aspects of political, social, and economic life. In 1974, in advance of the International Women's Year, the United Nations initiated its largest project on the comparative studies of the status of women in independent member states, focusing on women's legal status and economic status across geographies, where law was defined quite broadly as all aspects of any government policy related to women. The results of these studies were published in a single volume in English in 1976, just after the conference, in the Columbia Human Rights Law Review, featuring monographs on the status of women by scholars on location in 15 countries: Brazil, Egypt, France, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Iran, Jamaica, Kenya, Peru, the Philippines, Sweden, Togo, the US, and Yugoslavia. The studies were authorized by scholars with expertise in law, political science, and most from the increasingly dominant field of what was called population studies. The table of contents was standard across reports, from women and law to quantitative measures of demographics in health, morbidity, and mortality, education, employment, and ending with policy recommendations. So if we look at this table of contents, we get a sense of the vastness and the standardization of the status of women reports. In a moment of rising authoritarianisms and conservative populist movements across regions, in spaces like West and South Asia, across sub-Saharan Africa in the 1970s, activists and intellectuals organized to produce reports themselves, initiated by the 1975 conference. A report from India came in 1974, which we began with, that image, Towards Equality, published in December of 1974 at almost 500 pages. It was eventually authored by 10 prominent women leaders and activists who had expertise in social science and law, none of whom formally held government office. The report circulated widely, and in the decades that followed, it was proclaimed by feminist leaders to be the founding document of the Indian women's movement, setting the agenda for one of the most significant third world feminist movements in the late 20th century, and is regularly written upon and cited when talking about Indian feminisms. Towards Equality is a dense artifact that testifies to the complex history of social research in an increasingly technocratic post-colonial state. A partial glimpse of the complex social and political worlds translated into the language of seemingly neutral descriptions and quantifications of women's inequality and palatable policy recommendations. It was an account of women's economic participation with detailed measures of women under the law, women's labor, education rates, marriage, mortality, and morbidity. To write the report, members of the committee traveled to every state in India, meeting around what they account for at least 20,000 women across India in less than 2 years. The committee held 31 meetings over 65 days, and they completed the report in less than 14 months. Yet despite the vast terrain traveled to collect information, Towards Equality does not include other forms and genres that later the feminists who authored the report recount in their own memoirs to have been part of these women's social and political lives in the time of the research visits. Things like songs, poems, chants, accounts of subordination or conflict in these meetings. Nor do they offer accounts of caste subordination, of religious difference, of the social enforcement of difference in eating, touching, and cleaning that shaped the focus group encounter. The absence of individual narratives, affective expressions, quotidian details about social life in a policy report perhaps is unsurprising to us in a genre of action research. That genre which promises objectivity in aggregate and organizes around measurable demographic ideas of equality. The most conspicuous feature of the Towards Equality report actually appears at the end, which features a note of dissent from two of its authors, Lotaka Sarkar and Veena Majumdar. Sarkar and Majumdar argued that women required reserved seats for political office, in contrast to other authors of the report, and in contrast to feminists of an earlier generation who did not believe in affirmative action for women in politics. Their dissent was published in a moment when India had its first woman prime minister, Indira Gandhi. Gandhi's place as a woman prime minister was vexed for a growing women's movement that argued for the need for women in political office and yet insisted on the inadequacy of women like Gandhi, who did not represent the views of a progressive Indian feminism. Just 6 months after the publication of India's Towards Equality, in the middle of the United Nations Mexico City conference, Indira Gandhi declared in a period of emergency law, later called the emergency on June 25th, 1975. During the emergency, Indira Gandhi installed a set of authoritarian measures that suspended civil liberties to secure her power and violated a wide range of human rights, including the forced mass sterilization campaigns for population control. The authors of the Columbia Human Rights Journal reports and the India report went on to create the first women's studies centers and institutes in spaces of Asia and Africa. The institutionalization of women's studies as a social science enterprise based in aggregate data followed directly from these reports in the forms of departments, centers, and institutes dedicated to the social scientific study of women and development, funded by national governments, the United Nations and its many acronymized organizations, and Ford. What lesson might we learn from this brief account of some of these early reports? For the people who authored the Status of Women reports, like India's Towards Equality, claims for women's equal status and social rights were strategically placed in the domain of the social and the economic, using the language of poverty rather than the language of class exploitation or class struggle, to avoid direct confrontations with a sensitive, increasingly authoritarian post-colonial state on the brink of an emergency. As Mary John astutely argues in the context of the India report, feminist researchers saw in the genre of the policy report the opportunity to produce policy reforms for women without using overtly political language. These reports demonstrate how quickly the domain of feminist politics could be assimilated into the policy-oriented language of the post-colonial state and comparative international rights. Third world feminists worked with and against the state using its bureaucratic technologies of social scientific research, a limited and limiting tool of emancipation. But the story of the report does not end with the abundance of these early comparative policy reports based in law and demography. Many reports that came into being were never released. So let me turn to another example, the history of the post-colonial Pakistan and its suppression of Status of Women reports, which offer a stark contrast to the publication and triumphant legacy of India's Towards Equality report. In 1976, after India's report was spurred by the United Nations Women's Conference, the first Commission of Women in Pakistan authored a government-sponsored Status of Women report. The commission produced a detailed report on the status of women in Pakistan, which was suppressed immediately by the government under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and soon after, in 1977, when a military coup led to the overthrow of Bhutto and brought General Muhammad Zia al-Haq to power, the report was permanently disappeared. 2 years after Zia took power, he implemented what were then known as the Hudud Ordinances in 1979, a draconian set of laws that claimed to adhere to Sharia law and limited women's access to citizenship, bodily autonomy, and basic legal rights. These laws resembled other stringently patriarchal legal regimes passed following the rise of Islamicist movements across the Muslim world from 1979 onward. After the forced suppression of the 1976 report, the new Code of Hudud Ordinances, and the growing outcry from women against oppression under Muslim law, Zia convened his own Status of Women Commission in 1983, which produced a very different report in 1985. According to this report, the Status of Women Commission was formed with very divergent intentions than the 1976 Commission and in its commitments to secular rights. Zia's commission was based in the stated intention, as he describes, to, quote, Islamicize society and safeguard the rights of women as provided by the Holy Quran and the Sunnah, while responding to increased demands from NGOs, women's organizations, and an international rights community. This second Status of Women report, written by 25 women, turned out to be a bold reformulation of the genre of the Status of Women report, one that shifted the status of women from the assessment of secular laws that promised equality under post-colonial constitutionalism towards a textual exegesis of Muslim religious texts that sought to undermine Zia's own Sharia laws passed in 1979. The report was subversive of Zia's intention of the commission, deploying textual interpretations of Islamic law to make an argument for women's equality under Sharia law in opposition to the discrimination against women under the Hudud Ordinances. Like the 1976 report, this report, perhaps unsurprisingly, was also suppressed by Zia because it offered a vehement critique of the subordination of women under his draconian laws. Finally, in 1997, the first official Status of Women report was successfully published and circulated by the government of Pakistan, focused on law, education, labor, sex ratios, and reproductive rates, looking a lot like the Status of Women reports that we have encountered before. The authors of this report include Asma Jahangir, a premier feminist leader and human rights leader, a lawyer who had been arrested and jailed during Zia's regime. Her participation in a democratic state feminist project in Pakistan's third Status of Women Commission and then report came after decades of her radical opposition to authoritarianism and the state, and speaks of the complex and shifting terrain of third world feminist engagements, both with and in opposition to the state. The legal and quantitative report conformed to a now largely standardized Status of Women genre and signified a key effort by Pakistani feminists to return to constitutional promises of equality and in rejection to the Islamicization that had happened before. For a new generation of Pakistani feminists, it was imperative that the report not be suppressed. Soon, the feminist research collective Shirkatgah published a key summary of the report. The cover of Shirkatgah's report, like that of the 1977 report, features an illustrated image. In the center appears a woman embodied through the Linnaean symbol for women. And as I was listening to Banu Subramoniam, I was thinking we may need to reflect a little on feminist attachments to Linnaeus. She is outside of the household, a working woman, the door to her home appearing in the distance behind her. The cross-section element of the Linnaean symbol transformed into her arms in a balancing act, walking a tightrope suspended in the air. On one side, a man lounges upon her right arm. On the other arm hangs a balance of duties: cooking, cleaning, clothing that's hanging, the care of small gender-differentiated children. A thought bubble appears to the right of the woman's head with two equal signs of the sexes. As all things hang in the balance, we see her unrealized dream of equality between men and women. Throughout this summary report, we see multiple artistic representations by the artist Fika, a newspaper cartoon illustrator. Fika's illustrations, embedded between the bullet points and descriptions and quantifications of legal, social, and economic status, bring to life a different view of that dream of women's liberation. Fika's images describe women freed from the prison of the home, dreaming otherwise, in excess of the utilitarian genre of the report. Almost out of place, the images visualize the possibility of promise that the future offered by laws and policy recommendations. The framework of suppression offers a powerful hermeneutic to reflect on these reports, the reports that were both successfully published and circulated and the ones that were not. The archives of the Status of Women report reveal a history of research questions not asked, concepts and information left unmarked. These absences formed the basis of a wide range of critiques of women's movements that emerged from racial, caste, and ethnic minorities, from working class feminist movements, as well as international LGBTQ movements that were often in tension with earlier post-colonial feminist ideas. Indeed, the report was not a sign of revolutionary politics, nor did it purport to be. After all, the Status of Women report was to be actionable and action research by the state in pursuit of normative goals of economic and social development. Third world feminist researchers, in their desire to demonstrate the worth of women as research subjects, exalted the language of demography and quantitative indices in their claims to social scientific authority. Yet in doing so, feminists involved in report research naturalized sexual difference and sexual binarism and posited aggregate descriptions of women as the preferred object of action research. Even as third world women engaged diverse communities and languages in the research process, they offered little reflection on the complexities of social and political life in reports that would undo the aggregate picture of those uniform ideas of women and status as demographic description. histories of class exploitation, of racial difference, of caste violence, of gender nonconformity, of ongoing state violence against minorities, issues that shaped the very meaning of what it meant to study status and the category woman. Perhaps most strikingly, no Status of Women report offered comprehensive data or recommendations that addressed women's desires and often not same-sex sexualities, particularly those desires that exceeded the domain of heterosexual reproduction, measurable in indices of sex ratios and birth rates. And in some ways, what I want to argue here is that really we see compulsory heterosexuality taking on a new lexicon in the language of sex ratios, of indices, and of capabilities. By the late 1980s, the Status of Women report from different regions was so standardized in its measures that they could be produced in region by various authors, no longer needing to be named at all, reproduced as a knowledge economy that standardized even the covers. So there's not much to analyze here in the same way, with an abstract third world girl, and I think that's important, at the heart of the UN dove. If these reports were to be the founding documents of a wide array of feminist movements and institutions, what type of movements did they found? The genre of the Status of Women report would at points exceed the norms of its own frameworks. Reports led to new research techniques, socialities, engagements with the data created by communities and activists. The visuals on the covers of early reports provide a different narrative imaginary of women, picturing collectives invested in witnessing women's status and dreaming of the balancing act of everyday life. We might reflect on those excesses in the archive of reports to think how even the seemingly sterile archives may offer other ways of knowing beyond the tyranny of the measurable index of women's economic capacity. What is it that we seek in social scientific research on the status of women? And what visions of feminist futures did this genre on the status of women engender? I have sketched three key interrelated issues that emerge from this brief genealogy of the Status of Women report and its emergence as a dominant genre on writing women. The first is the now hegemonic, self-reproducing international political economy of reports based on ideas of commensurability across nation states. This requires much further study to understand the massive political economy of state and international foundation-sponsored projects on the status of women that expanded rapidly from the 1970s until today, confining the great majority of researchers studying global issues of women and gender in policy-oriented social science, confining them to policy-oriented social science that utilize the neutralizing language of poverty to obscure structures of racialized caste and labor exploitation. Second, the centrality of gender essentialist disciplines of demography and population in the Status of Women report. Based in increasingly dominant political economy, these reports naturalized biologically deterministic notions of sexual difference that sutured global feminist projects to gender essentialist arguments. And we see this argument again and again and again in the 1970s and 80s. Women as half of the world, women as half of the world's population. In a time where dangerous trans exclusionary rhetoric has become essential for new authoritarianisms, we must ask about our attachments to the essentialism of field formations, of demography and demographic data, and the impact of this attachment to gender normative disciplinary fields for coalitional politics now. Third, the marginalization of other ways of knowing through the standardization of the report. The vast knowledge economy on the status of women came to marginalize other ways of knowing in much of the world, particularly material support from humanistic approaches to the study of women. Gender and development centers, what we see are a series and series, multiple white papers that use the social sciences and really underdevelop or really make as absent humanistic field formations. My point is not simply about democratizing representation or fields, that the report fails to accurately describe what they purport to represent, that there's a truth out there if only we could include poetry, but that the genre conjures how we comprehend social and political life and translates it into policy through a framework that is limiting and has in fact created the categories through which we begin to describe the social. And the continuous citation of these reports on status give the report a unique epistemic authority across a wide range of domains, from policy research to our own scholarship. Almost 50 years after the initiation of the UN Women's Year, there is an excess of archives of policy reports on global women. Many women researchers in the third world could only make a living and put their training to work within the strict genre of policy reports for nations, for NGOs, for the United Nations, or foundations. Man, saying nations and foundations and social scientific reports framed by Veena Majumdar as action research have absorbed and wholly consumed the labor of activist intellectuals, transforming into a genre often more characterized by inaction than action. And as people spilled ink writing report after report, fewer words were left to write otherwise in other genres. Less time was available for researchers to ask other questions, and little to no institutional space was available for exploring alternative ways of knowing outside of the language of measures and indices. Despite half a century of social scientific reports, the lives of many women in much of the world remain unequal and is either unchanged or worse in terms of their economic, social, and political lives in the 21st century. As Peggy Antrobus lamented to me in 2021, reflecting on the unrealized dreams of early international feminists like herself, perhaps the goal for research on women would have looked different if third world feminists had known, quote, how fragile all of our struggles for progress could be and how swiftly they would be reversed in a moment. My point in reflecting on the rise of the documentation on women and the status of women is that we must reckon with the overwhelming dominance of the genre of the quantitative report and feminist investments in an economic calculus of freedom, a reckoning with, to think with Jennifer Morgan. In reflecting on these vexed genealogies, we might work together to envision a more flexible idea of action research in and beyond the social scientific report, collectively working to produce new lexicons. Today is the day of new lexicons between me and Banu Subramaniam, based in methods, narrative techniques, and genres that move beyond measurable indices to engage the unruly, complicated life of social difference. I believe, most of all, that feminist theory must confront the vastly unequal allocation of resources in the political economy of global policy reports that has purposefully underdeveloped the field of women's studies in the third world, suturing it to the quantitative social sciences. Now, even these infrastructures, like the Ford Foundation, that funding that used to support the study for women and sexual minorities, are being hollowed out under alarming authoritarianisms, Modi's India, that claim foreign funding for women, queer, and trans people to be antithetical to national values. As we look at these images now, we cannot see the faces of the many women illustrated on the cover of the summary reports. What expressions might have been found on these faces? Perhaps their expressions would reflect excitement at seeing women studied in policy research for the first time. Perhaps their faces would be filled with dread for what was to come in the 21st century. For me, feminist theory, at its heart, is a project of dreaming in the language of critique. It is a project of imagining otherwise. 50 years after the first Status of Women reports, the expressions and dreams of most of the women in the world remain largely hidden from view, as people in the pandemic bear witness to endless data visualizations of their decline. Disillusioned with a biopolitics of life that has so fully co-opted the language of freedom through individual capability, Today, we see a mass politics that demands feminisms that are world-making and sustain the very basic tenets of living in the face of violent authoritarianism. We need to rethink feminist attachments to demography, demographic thinking, those biologically essentialist and deterministic biopolitics. Then only might we collectively sustain genres, engage different modes of research, and create durable infrastructures of thought that better care for the living. Thank you so much.